The room was silent except for the hum of overhead lights. March 15th, 2020. Sunday evening. A conference call that would reshape the financial architecture of the world's largest economy was taking place not in some grand marble hall, but over encrypted phone lines connecting kitchen tables, home offices, and basement studies across America. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, sat surrounded by papers that outlined what was about to happen, something that had never been done before, not at this scale, not with this audacity. In a few hours, the Federal Reserve would announce it was prepared to buy an unlimited amount of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Unlimited. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. Outside, America slept, unaware that when morning came, the old rules of money, the ones taught in economics textbooks, the ones that separated capitalism from something else entirely, would be rewritten in real time. What does it mean when a nation's central bank becomes the buyer of last resort, not just for emergency lending, but for the government's own debt? When does monetary policy cross the line into something closer to financial alchemy? And if the future can be purchased with printed money, who really pays the price? The story begins not in 2020, but decades earlier, in the slow erosion of boundaries that once seemed sacred. For most of American history, the Federal Reserve operated under a simple principle. It could influence the economy by adjusting interest rates, but it could not directly finance government spending. That was the line. Cross it, and you risk the kind of hyperinflation that destroyed Weimar Germany, that turned Zimbabwe's currency into wallpaper, that made a wheelbarrow of cash insufficient to buy bread. The Fed was independent precisely because it needed to say no when politicians wanted easy money. It was the adult in the room, the brake on the accelerator, the last defense against the intoxicating delusion that prosperity could be conjured from nothing. But then came 2008, the financial crisis that ate Lehman Brothers, that froze credit markets, that sent unemployment soaring and home prices plummeting. The Fed, led then by Ben Bernanke, did something previously unthinkable. It began buying massive quantities of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities in what was euphemistically called quantitative easing. QE. The acronym made it sound technical, bloodless, like an accounting adjustment rather than a fundamental reimagining of what a central bank could do. Bernanke, an academic who had spent his career studying the Great Depression, was convinced that the Fed's failure to act aggressively in the 1930s had turned a recession into a catastrophe. He would not make that mistake. The Fed's balance sheet, which had held less than $1 trillion in assets before the crisis, swelled to over $4 trillion by the time the program ended. Critics called it money printing. Defenders called it necessary. Both were right. The architects of this new approach insisted it was temporary. Emergency measures. Once the crisis passed, the Fed would shrink its balance sheet, sell off those bonds, return to normal. And for a while, it seemed like they might. The economy recovered, however unevenly. Unemployment fell. The stock market soared. But something had changed in the American financial psyche. A taboo had been broken. The unthinkable had been done, and the sky hadn't fallen. When the next crisis came, and there's always a next crisis, the question would not be whether the Fed should intervene massively, but only how massive the intervention should be. That next crisis arrived on the wings of a virus. COVID-19 didn't care about economic theory or central bank independence or the careful distinctions between fiscal and monetary policy. It simply shut down the world. In March 2020, as cities locked down and businesses closed, financial markets didn't just decline, they convulsed. The stock market saw its fastest crash in history, faster even than 1929. But more alarming was what happened in the bond market, the supposedly safe foundation of the entire financial system. Treasury bonds, the instruments backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, began to malfunction. Prices swung wildly. Liquidity evaporated. Pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, all the institutions that depend on treasuries as the bedrock of stability, suddenly couldn't buy or sell them without moving prices dramatically. The plumbing of global finance was breaking. Inside the Federal Reserve, the crisis demanded decisions measured not in weeks or days, but in hours. Powell, a lawyer by training rather than an economist, had been appointed by Trump but was now facing a moment that would define his legacy more than any political allegiance. He was surrounded by career Fed officials who had lived through 2008, who had seen what happened when central banks hesitated. They remembered Lehman Brothers collapsing because authorities waited too long. They remember the European Central Bank's Mario Draghi declaring he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, and those 3 words stopping a continental financial panic. The Fed had tools. The question was whether it had the will to use them without limit. The weekend meetings were tense. Video screens showing pale faces. Economic models predicting catastrophe. Markets closed, but ready to open Monday morning to chaos. The Fed had already cut interest rates to 0, already restarted quantitative easing, already opened emergency lending facilities. But it wasn't enough. The Treasury market was still broken. Corporate bonds were in free fall. Municipal debt, the bonds that finance schools, hospitals, roads, was becoming untouchable. Without functioning credit markets, the economy wouldn't just contract, it would collapse. Depression, not recession. Breadlines, not unemployment statistics. Powell made the decision. The Federal Reserve would announce, in the clearest language possible, that it was prepared to buy unlimited quantities of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Not a specific number, not a cap, unlimited. And then it went further. The Fed would, for the first time in its history, begin buying corporate bonds, including the debt of individual companies. It would buy municipal bonds. It would buy securities backed by auto loans, credit card debt, small business loans. The Central Bank of the United States would become, temporarily but definitively, the buyer of last resort for enormous swaths of the American financial system. The announcement came late on Sunday, March 15th. By the time markets opened on Monday, the message was clear. The Fed would not let markets fail. Whatever it took, however much it cost. The balance sheet, already swollen from previous crises, would expand without predetermined limit. In the span of just 3 months, the Fed would purchase over $2 trillion in assets. By year's end, its balance sheet would reach nearly $8 trillion, double what it had been at the peak of the 2008 response. The numbers were so large they became abstractions, difficult to comprehend in human terms. But here's what those numbers meant in practice. When the U.S. Treasury issued bonds to finance the massive COVID relief packages, the trillions in stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits, small business loans, the Federal Reserve was there by them. Not directly from the Treasury, which would have been too obviously a violation of the old taboos, but from banks and dealers in what's called the secondary market. The technical distinction mattered to lawyers and central bankers. It mattered not at all in terms of the practical effect. The government spent money it didn't have, issued debt to cover the spending, and the Fed ensured there were buyers for that debt by effectively printing money to purchase it. The circle was complete. This is what's known, in the cold language of economics, as debt monetization. The central bank financing government spending through money creation. It's the thing that every economics textbook warns against. The path that leads to inflation and currency debasement and the loss of credibility that takes decades to rebuild. Except this time, inflation didn't come. Not right away. For over a year, prices remained stable. Deflation, not inflation, seemed the greater risk. The Fed's defenders could point to this and say, "See, the old rules don't apply. We can do this. We must do this. The alternative is worse." But economics, like physics, has a way of asserting itself eventually. The money that poured into the system didn't disappear. It flooded into asset markets first: stocks, real estate, cryptocurrencies. The wealthy, who owned these assets, became dramatically wealthier. The gap between the rich and everyone else, already a chasm, became a canyon. Meanwhile, the trillions in government spending combined with supply chain disruptions created shortages. Too much money chasing too few goods. By 2021, inflation began to rise. By 2022, it was running at rates not seen in 40 years. The Fed, which had insisted that inflation was transitory, a temporary blip, was forced to acknowledge it had miscalculated. Interest rates, kept at zero to support the economy, now had to rise aggressively to fight the inflation the Fed itself had helped create. The whiplash was brutal. Mortgages that had been affordable at 3% interest became expensive at 7%. The housing market froze. Stock portfolios that had soared now cratered. Tech companies that had thrived in the era of free money suddenly faced a world where capital had a cost again. Layoffs followed. The recession that the Fed had tried to prevent by unlimited bond buying was now being induced deliberately to control inflation. The very people the intervention was supposed to help, the workers, the middle class, found themselves caught between rising prices and rising unemployment. This is the cruel paradox at the heart of the story. The Fed's intervention in 2020 prevented an immediate catastrophe. Without it, the financial system might have seized up entirely, unemployment might have reached Depression-era levels, businesses might have collapsed by the millions. The counterfactual, the disaster that didn't happen, is always invisible, always speculative. We can never know for certain how bad it would have been, but we do know what did happen. The Fed crossed lines that had once seemed uncrossable, and in doing so, changed the rules of the game permanently. Because here's what America learned in 2020. When a crisis comes, the Federal Reserve will buy whatever needs to be bought to prevent financial collapse. Unlimited support, whatever it takes. This knowledge fundamentally alters behavior. If investors know the Fed will backstop the market, they take bigger risks. If the government knows the Fed will help finance its debt, it spends more freely. If everyone believes the central bank will prevent disaster, the moral hazard, the incentive to take dangerous gambles because someone else bears the cost, becomes embedded in the system itself. The technical term for this is the Fed put. The idea that the Federal Reserve provides a floor under asset prices, a guarantee that it will intervene before things get too bad. And once that floor exists, once everyone believes in it, it becomes impossible to remove. Any attempt to let markets fall naturally, to allow creative destruction, to permit the discipline of failure, these become politically and practically untenable. The Fed is trapped by its own success. It saved the system in 2020, and in doing so, ensured it would have to save the system again, and again, each time with more aggressive intervention, each time pushing further into uncharted territory. Consider what this means for the future. The U.S. government's debt is now over $34 trillion and rising. Interest payments on that debt are becoming one of the largest items in the federal budget, exceeding spending on defense, on education, on infrastructure. As interest rates rise, those payments consume more and more of the budget, leaving less for everything else. The political system shows no sign of reining in spending. Neither party has a credible plan for balancing the budget. The math suggests that at some point, the debt becomes unsustainable. But unsustainable according to what standard? If the Federal Reserve is willing to buy unlimited quantities of government debt, then the usual constraints don't apply. The government can spend without immediate consequence because the Fed will ensure there are buyers for its bonds. This is the future that was sold in March 2020, though few understood it at the time. A future where fiscal and monetary policy blend together, where the distinction between the central bank and the Treasury becomes semantic rather than real, where money is whatever we say it is because the institution with the power to create it has committed to doing so without limit. It's a future that looks, in certain uncomfortable ways, like the monetary arrangements of economies we once pitted, regimes where central banks were subservient to governments, where printing presses ran to finance deficits, where inflation was the hidden tax that eroded savings and transferred wealth from creditors to debtors. The defenders of what happened insist it's different. America is different. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, which gives the U.S. privileges no other nation enjoys. As long as the world needs dollars for trade, for oil, for reserves, the Fed can print them without the usual consequences. This is called exorbitant privilege, and it's real. But it's also fragile. It depends on trust, the belief that the dollar will hold its value, that the Fed is ultimately independent, that America's institutions are sound. Trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And every time the Fed expands its balance sheet by trillions, every time it buys assets it previously wouldn't touch, every time it subordinates long-term stability to short-term crisis management, that trust erodes a little more. The people who made these decisions in 2020 were not fools or villains. They were intelligent, well-intentioned public servants facing an unprecedented crisis with imperfect information and impossible choices. They chose to act rather than to wait. They chose the certainty of today's intervention over the uncertainty of tomorrow's consequences. In the moment, with markets collapsing and hospitals overflowing, who can say they were wrong? But intentions don't determine outcomes. The road to every economic disaster is paved with decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. There's a scene that captures the transformation, though it went largely unnoticed amid the chaos of 2020. In June of that year, the Federal Reserve began buying individual corporate bonds, not bundled securities, but actual bonds from specific companies. Apple, Microsoft, AT&T. The Central Bank of the United States was now directly supporting the debt of private corporations. To make these purchases, the Fed set up a special purpose vehicle, a legal entity that could buy the bonds while maintaining a technical separation from the Fed itself. But everyone understood the reality. This was the Fed's money, the Fed's decision, the Fed's responsibility. The corporation that served as the vehicle's investment manager, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, already deeply intertwined with the companies whose bonds it would now be buying with Fed money. The revolving door between Wall Street and the central bank, always present but usually discreet, was now spinning openly. The people making decisions about which bonds to buy had worked for the firms that issued them, would work for them again after their government service ended. This wasn't corruption in the crude sense. No one was taking bribes or breaking laws. It was something more subtle and more corrosive. The complete capture of public institutions by private interests, done in the name of saving the system, using the vocabulary of technocratic necessity. If stories like this fascinate you, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more hidden chapters of financial history to light, the ones that shape our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The aftermath has been strange and unsettling. The economy didn't collapse, but it didn't return to normal either. Instead, we live now in a permanent state of extraordinary monetary policy. The Fed's balance sheet, which was supposed to shrink back to normal after the crisis, remains bloated. Every attempt to reduce it triggers market panic. Interest rates, which rose briefly to fight inflation, face constant political pressure to come back down. The government continues to spend vastly more than it collects in taxes, issuing debt that someone must buy. And everyone knows who the ultimate buyer is, even if they don't say it aloud. We've entered what economic historians might call the endgame of the post-war monetary system. The arrangement established at Bretton Woods in 1944, where the dollar replaced gold as the anchor of global finance, has been slowly unraveling for decades. Nixon ended gold convertibility in 1971. The Fed gained enormous discretion in the years that followed. But there were still limits, still norms, still the sense that some things couldn't be done. Those limits are gone now. We're in uncharted waters, sailing by instruments that may no longer be calibrated correctly toward a horizon we can't quite see. The optimistic scenario is that this is manageable, that modern monetary theory, the idea that governments that control their own currency can't go bankrupt, is essentially correct, that inflation can be controlled through careful management, that the system is more resilient than the pessimists believe. Maybe the Fed's actions in 2020 will be remembered as the moment when policymakers finally understood that money is a tool, that artificial scarcity makes no sense when real resources sit idle, that the old orthodoxies were needlessly cruel. But there's a darker possibility, one that keeps serious people awake at night. That we've built an enormous structure of debt on the assumption that interest rates will stay low forever, that the Fed will always intervene, that the dollar's reserve status is permanent. And that when one of those assumptions fails, when rates rise too high, or the Fed's credibility cracks, or another currency begins to challenge the dollar's supremacy, the whole edifice will come apart faster than anyone expects. The crisis won't announce itself with warning sirens. It will arrive on some ordinary Tuesday when the Treasury holds an auction and there aren't enough buyers, when the Fed steps in to purchase the bonds but the market reaction isn't relief but fear, when the world realizes that the emperor has no clothes and the dollars in our bank accounts are backed by nothing but the government's ability to tax an increasingly indebted population and a central bank willing to create infinite amounts of currency that may, at some point, cease to be money in any meaningful sense. History offers uncomfortable parallels. Rome debased its currency to finance its military and maintain its empire. The inflation that followed hollowed out its economy and contributed to its eventual collapse. Revolutionary France printed assignats to escape its debt. Within years, they were worthless. The examples are countless, and they all follow a similar pattern. Governments borrow beyond their means. Central banks monetize the debt. Inflation erodes trust, and the currency fails. America's belief that it's different, that it's exceptional, may turn out to be correct. Or it may turn out to be the same hubris that preceded every other monetary collapse in history. The people who will pay the price are already being selected, though they don't know it yet. Savers, whose dollars will buy less each year as inflation erodes purchasing power. Pensioners, whose fixed incomes will prove insufficient as costs rise. Workers, whose wages will lag behind price increases no matter how tight the labor market. The young, who inherit an economy structured around the interests of older generations, with housing unaffordable and good jobs scarce. They will learn, as countless generations have learned before them, that when governments and central banks promise to solve all problems with printed money, the solution eventually becomes the problem. Yet it's impossible to watch the decisions of March 2020 with simple condemnation. The alternative, letting markets collapse, letting businesses fail by the millions, letting unemployment soar while the Fed stood aside in the name of moral hazard or long-term stability, would have inflicted immediate, tangible suffering on tens of millions of people. The people making those decisions had to choose between two kinds of future pain: the certain agony of inaction, or the uncertain but potentially catastrophic consequences of unprecedented intervention. They chose intervention. They chose to save the present and worry about the future later. Most of us, in their position, would have done the same. And that's perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. The system that was built over decades, the architecture of unlimited Fed intervention and ever-growing government debt, and the slow merging of fiscal and monetary policy. It wasn't created by a conspiracy or a coup. It was created by rational people making rational decisions in response to real crises. Each intervention slightly larger than the last, each precedent making the next step easier, until we arrived at a place no one intended to go. There was no single moment when America decided to mortgage its future. It happened gradually, crisis by crisis, trillion by trillion, decision by decision. The bill for all of this will come due. Not today, perhaps not for years, but eventually. Economics has laws as real as physics, even if they operate on longer timescales. You cannot print unlimited money without consequences. You cannot borrow indefinitely without reckoning. You cannot promise more than you can deliver without, someday, facing the gap between promise and reality. The question is not whether the bill will come, but who will pay it and how much they'll owe. March 15th, 2020 will be remembered, though probably not in the way the people making decisions that night expected. It will be remembered not as the day the Fed saved America, but as the day America crossed a threshold from which there is no easy return. The day the central bank became the buyer of last resort, not just for markets, but for the government itself. The day the old boundaries dissolved. The day the future was sold for the present and the Federal Reserve. That institution created to stand apart, to say no, to be the guardian of long-term stability, became instead the enabler of short-term political expediency and long-term economic uncertainty. We live now in the world that decision created, a world where money is whatever policymakers need it to be, where debt is unlimited because someone can always be found to buy it, where the consequences of excess are always deferred, pushed into a tomorrow that never quite arrives, until suddenly it does. The machinery of this system works smoothly right up until the moment it doesn't. And when it stops, when the buyers disappear, when inflation spirals, when trust evaporates, it will stop very quickly, and the unwinding will be catastrophic. But maybe that's too dark. Maybe the engineers of this system are smarter than their predecessors. Maybe they found a way to thread the needle, to maintain credibility while creating money, to finance unlimited government spending without inflation or currency collapse. Maybe the rules really have changed. Maybe this time is different. What would you have done if you were in that room in March 2020, knowing what you knew then, but not what you know now? Would you have authorized unlimited bond purchases to save the present, or would you have accepted the immediate pain to preserve the future? Tell me in the comments, because this isn't just a question about monetary policy. It's a question about how we value time itself, about whether we sacrifice tomorrow for today, about the price of survival, when survival might mean something is lost that can never be recovered. And if you crave more stories that expose the fragile architecture of the systems we take for granted, stories that force you to confront the space between what we're told and what's true, subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is being written right now, in meeting rooms and trading floors and central bank headquarters. And it will determine whether we look back on 2020 as the moment we were saved or the moment we sealed our fate.